Welcome you to this lecture on the way of things. The subject that we're going to discuss in this lecture is an issue on the different angles of bedrock and alluvials that we find in the desert, and in particular one of their particular points. It's an important place in the desert to understand, and it's one of them places that if you understand it and know what's going on at this particular area, it often gives you a concept of places further away. So let's get started. To start with, we're going to start with a basic mountain, and this could be virtually any mountain. In this case, though, while it can be of different sizes, scale does matter. This needs to be a mountain 500 foot at least, and preferably 1,000, 2,000, and as it gets into something 5,000 and 10,000 foot tall, it becomes much more pronounced. But it's still one of the basic structures in the desert. Now, you have this primary angle, and this angle is generally made out of bedrock. It can be basalt, it can be granite, it can be limestone or sandstone, almost any kind of stone it can be. And then the runoff from this makes what I call the alluvial angle. Try to get this pen to work proper. And this angle is marked by two major properties. One, it's generally shallower than the first, and whereas this is primarily made of stone that's in one piece more or less, this of course is a gravelly material and rocks. And then the final angle that we have, and it often isn't divided real well, but it's an angle that essentially the alluvial is running into something else. Now it could be a dry lake, it could be coming in from another mountain range, any number of possible ends of this alluvial. It could be another alluvial, it could be actually even another rocky slope. It just depends on what the particulars of this area is. But what we're going to discuss today is this area right here. This area is very important in the desert. It really defines the area below on the alluvial and many of the environmental attributes above on the rocky surfaces of the mountain. And what we have, the basics, and we'll start with what really makes it, one of the major deals that make it important is when it rains up here, that rain is being collected by the mountain itself, and because the mountain often doesn't have the absorption rate that the alluvial has, it runs off. It runs off the rock, especially if it's something like granite or something. It has very little absorption, whereas the sandstone will have a little more absorption of the rainwater. But this area right here will get the most water and the most often, not unlike the confluent if you've gotten into that lecture. But it's a little different than the confluent. It has some different attributes. One of the things is as the water comes down here and collects and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger in a thunderstorm, or for that matter even a winter rain, the rocks and debris that it's moving tend to get bigger. At first up here it can only move maybe some sand and then some gravel, and pretty soon down around here it's moving boulders. Let's say we got a mountain that's 3,000 to 4,000 foot tall. That amount of water being collected starts to move actually rocks and boulders, which get deposited right there. Now, when they hit this place, the first thing they're going to do is slow down, because like the confluent, the angle is shifted to a shallower angle, so the water soon loses velocity and slows down, and now it can't carry the rocks and debris that it once could on this steeper slope. And what that means is that the biggest stuff gets deposited here, and you'll find any alluvial fan or anything like that, it'll be the coarsest material up at the top and get finer and finer as it goes down. And that's because you get less and less water. The water is being soaked right into the soil, and of course because this is rocks, gravel and such, very coarse material, it soaks up a lot of water. So this area here then has that attribute. It's got a lot of water deep down. Now the other thing about this, if we were to look down on one of these, what we'd find is if this is a mountain, let's say a nice circular mountain, and this would be the cut, and at some point you got a canyon running down through the bottom of this, and all this is runoff. And then it gets to this, and this is our alluvial, or the angle change. This is right here. The cut in the mountain at the bottom, right here, is oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes, the deepest cut into the mass of the mountain. It's the deepest, and again, not always, but it can be sometimes a narrow place. Why? Because the erosion is happening faster, because the more boulders and gravel and sand and coarse material is getting bigger velocities, where up in here it doesn't have the velocity to carry the bigger stuff. Down here it does. So it's eroding in a sense faster, and means it's deeper, usually, not always, but we'll get to that. So regardless of the orientation of this cut as to the sun, whether it's north, south, east, west, whichever way the wash, this particular wash is orientated, because it's in a deep cut, it reduces the sunlight available in that cut. So you have the most water most often right at this bottom of this cut, and you have reduced sunlight, which reduces the rate of evaporation regardless of its north-south orientation. Even if it's facing due south on the south slope, as the sun arcs across the sky, it may only be able to put sunlight down in that canyon for just, an hour or two, maybe 3 or 4, and in some cases a deep cut maybe for only 20-30 minutes. And there again, even in some, yet it'll have permanent shade, which automatically brings it to a much cooler level, which means you have less evaporation. So you end up with kind of a mini oasis, and a lot of times, especially if it's a deep cut on a large mountain, you can walk into this place and you can actually smell and sense the humidity. Whereas out here on the alluvial or up here on the mountainside, you have that sense of dry air, and it just has a different feel to it. Where down in this cut, you're going to have plants, if you have plants. In some places they get blasted out of there a lot. But you'll sometimes often sense that humidity coming up out of them rocks, protected by that shade. And you'll have plants in here that often either don't grow anywhere else, or they're not in that condition. You might have say a mesquite that's close to this area, and other mesquites down here. And this mesquite's just thriving. It's got all kinds of new leaves. It's just doing wonderful. And these leaves, these mesquites further out, will look parched, owing to the fact that less evaporation, more water, so on. And of course the wildlife is going to respond to that, whether it's your birds, your coyotes, and so forth. Now, another interesting thing about this particular shift in the angle, unlike this one that's often can be over 500 or 1,000 yards, which just barely works its way to a dry lake or something, this particular one often has a knife edge. A lot of times you can take one step from the alluvial right onto the bedrock of the mountain. It's often a very sharply defined place. And for reasons that we'll get into in another lecture on structure, oftentimes this is an area that has a propensity for springs. And we'll talk about that in another lecture. But it's just one of them places that if you're going along, let's say here's a mountain ridge, and here's a slope, and this is our high point, and these are our alluvials down here. We'll say playing out this area. All of these places are going to be, all these canyons feeding down are going to have a point like that, and each one of those is going to be a focus point for life, each one of them. Now, another pattern that you'll sometimes have that's also well to be aware of and how it works is sometimes you can have a canyon. We'll say this is a canyon bottom. If I can get this pen to work. Okay. And we'll say right here is the beginning or the divider between the alluvial and the bedrock. That this is where our bedrock. But this mountain might actually have a canyon here, and a canyon here, and a canyon here, and a canyon here, and a canyon here. And each one of these and is got that same quality about it. It's a focal point. It has the change in speed of the water. It is a place where wildlife, is concentrated. And a lot of times when you walk up a canyon like this and you know that you're in a bedrock is all around this. This is all bedrock, say, like this, and maybe even beyond like so. And you're walking up this canyon and you see all these side canyons that terminate with bedrock, bedrock and then alluvial. Each one of these you want to kind of keep aware of as you were to walk up. If you found one in particular that had, say, a lot of tracks, say coyote and such going up it, you know that that's a good indication that there's either a food source or a water source in one of these side canyons. And of course you'd look at strata and stuff like that. Typically the one at the end is going to be the biggest and the most important in the area. But that's not always true. So when you're walking the desert, you want to be aware of this and be concerned as far as wildlife and how wildlife is keen on this. Now, in a sense, there's two basic variations of this particular phenomenon. And one is steep and the other shallow, and of course they blend back and forth into one another, but it's good to understand that there are some differences between the two and how they end up working for wildlife. A very steep slope, one say coming off of often a very steep mountain, and this pen just isn't cooperating very much. And then might have a very steep alluvial to boot. It looks like this thing's just about dead. Well, maybe not. What's typically going to happen is this is oftentimes a very, very shallow or very narrow, excuse me, cut in the mountain because the water's going so fast. It's coming off this so fast and it's cutting so hard right from the top to the bottom. It's cutting hard. And this alluvial will often have banks. That is to say, if we're looking at it sideways, you might actually find that the bedrock part of the mountain actually comes down here and like this, and the alluvial itself has a channel that's cut. And what you find in here is that the area often in here is somewhat sterile. Even though it's got the humidity and it'll have some broadleaf plants and such, because the water comes racing through there, none of your longer living, your mesquites, your greasewoods, like that can live there because they just get ripped out every time it flash floods. So it only gets left to annuals, and only annuals that can live in the coarse gravel or the rocky sides. But there is, oddly enough, the humidity. Now, if you get a situation where you have something on the other end of the spectrum, and perhaps that's a better way of understanding it rather than two types, it's a spectrum. And that spectrum would be if you have a bedrock mountain that's very shallow, as we stood it, then it's also going to typically have a very shallow, or the slope of that alluvial is not going to be very steep either. It's going to be like so. And what that does is it spreads the focus point out. You don't have this tightly focused resource there. And so you'll find that at this point here, you start getting more of your mesquite, your smoke trees, desert willow, trees like that start, and they'll often be the biggest here and then descending in size as they go down the wash. And they end up with kind of a curious situations that sometimes hide that, at least for a while, is that as you go further down the wash, that soil gets sandier, it gets more plant debris in it. It's a richer soil, so it holds the moisture better. It doesn't allow it to go as deep, but it holds it better, and it has more nutrients. And so you tend to get, as you go down, you'll start to find a wider variety of plants. And sometimes the trees, like say a desert willow, that might be right at the mouth of it, is getting a lot of water, but is in a poor gravelly soil and gets beat to death half the time when a rainstorm does come. Whereas a tree here maybe doesn't get water as often, but it's in better soil and it doesn't get the beating that some of these trees up at the front get. So it's doing reasonably well, but for different reasons. And those different reasons sometimes will show themselves. You'll come along and say, well, look, here, these ones are doing good, and these ones are down here doing bad, but they're the same size, essentially. Well, you can reason then that the last good rain only got to about here, whereas it did get to these. Or if you see something, you know, somewhat different, you get down here and say, well, these trees seem to be doing a little better than the trees further up. Well, if the storm was big enough and it took rocks and battered them, the trunks and the leaves, and really didn't get anything more for it, that these guys got water and these guys got water, that part ends up the same, except these took a beating. You'll see, again, a kind of a difference. You'll be able to read that into the situation. So to kind of recap this, it's because of the angles, and because it's a point where the water is the most and the most often in the desert. That makes a difference. And so you're going to have birds, you'll have fly in here, you'll have coyotes, you'll have bighorn sheep that are oftentimes, you'll find bighorn sheep that really don't like the bottom of the canyon, but to go down there and eat some mesquite or some other plant that's green down here only in this area, they don't need to go way down the alluvial. They can come off a escape terrain fairly close, get into something that's a little greener, and of course you're going to have the predators follow suit. You're going to have your jackrabbit, you know, especially if it's a shallow. Now if it's real steep, a lot of times it's an area that the jackrabbit doesn't care for. But if it's a shallow meeting where these two angles are, a lot of times this is actually a jackrabbit hotspot. So we have, you know, a lot of things that we can look at, and of course one of the things you can also use with the modern technology that we have, even though this is an ancient knowledge, we have at our disposal modern things like topographical maps, even though some people kind of consider them dated in light of other technologies. You can actually see these places on topographical maps, and so if you're going to go into an area, you can actually look at a map and say, well, here's some possibilities that I might want to look at pertaining to wildlife or plant life. And of course, on something as modern as Google Earth, you can see this phenomena directly and educate yourself using that as to the propensity and the intensity that this particular point in the desert environment has. And with that, I hope you enjoyed this lecture on structure, the lay of the land, as some of the old timers called it, and go out and find it and experience this phenomenon. And with that, I thank you.